Hello, everyone. Uh, it is my really great pleasure to start this session. Probably some people will be still coming, but since this is the introduction, nobody really cares what I say, so I can start. And I'm really happy to have European Society for Psychology and Philosophy conference in Warsaw. And I'm giving the floor to our director of the Institute, Professor Valentina Lepri.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Valentina Lepri. I'm the director of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology of the Polish Academy of Sciences, or IFISPAN for short. As director of the Institute and philosopher by education, it's a great privilege to welcome you to Warsaw, to Pałac Staszica, for the annual conference of the European Society for Philosophy and Psychology. We are delighted that our institute has the opportunity to host such a significant interdisciplinary event, which brings together leading scholars from around the world. The conference program is truly impressive, and I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Marcin Miłkowski, our colleague, for the excellent organization of this meeting. As you maybe already know, next year, IFISPAN will celebrate its 17th anniversary. This is a remarkable milestone for us, and the presence of such distinguished community here today is a further proof of the vitality and international standing of our institute. We take great pride in fostering a dynamic academic environment, and we are confident that these days of intense scientific exchange will leave you with lasting and insightful memories of both IFISPAN and the Polish Academy of Sciences as a whole. I won't keep you any longer. Time is running out, and we are all eager to begin with the scientific program, and in particular with our distinguished keynote speakers, whose presence here today is a privilege for us all. Thank you very much, and I wish you an inspiring and fruitful conference.
Many thanks for that introduction. I'm Chris Cummins. I'm the linguistics point person on the program committee. And on behalf of the committee, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first plenary speaker, Professor Petra Schumacher. Petra is a professor of empirical linguistics and German linguistics at the University of Cologne, and also finds time to be speaker of the SFB 1252 Prominence in Language. Petra has published extensively and influentially on a wide range of topics, some at the syntax pragmatics interface, as in her very important and interesting work on pronouns and reference. She's published very interesting work on the relationship between sign and gesture. And perhaps most interestingly, a topic she's going to call back to you today, that of metonymy in reference. So without further ado, let me welcome on behalf of the committee, Petra Schumacher.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here in Warsaw, and I'm very happy to present some work on meaning extension and adaptation in real time to you this morning. So what I want to do within the next hour or so is that I want to provide an overview of the real-time processing research on metonymy and discuss aspects relating to the representation and the processing of different types of metonymy. And what I want to do is I will look at various sources of variation in metonymy processing, in particular the sociocultural context, historical context, situational knowledge that we might use and that could result in meaning adaptation, And ultimately, I want to look at the impact of individual cognitive traits, which also leads to the following symposium that looks at individual variation in semantic and pragmatic processing, which I think is a pretty hot topic these days. So what do I mean by meaning extension? Let's start with a couple of examples this morning. So when I say something like life is a roller coaster, yeah, I compare life to a roller coaster with its ups and downs, twists and turns. And so this is what we typically refer to as a metaphor, which requires a mapping across domains, across the domain of life and the domain of roller coasters. And we are constructing a similarity between life and roller coasters. Yeah, the cappuccino asked for the menu, the example that you already saw on the first slide. In this case, if we imagine that we're at a restaurant and one waiter tells the other waiter that the cappuccino asked for the menu, then they refer to a person who is contextually associated with the cappuccino. So this is what we typically refer to as metonymy. That is the mapping within a domain where we find some kind of association between the original meaning, the substance, the drink, and the intended meaning, the person associated with this drink. There's other cases of extended meaning. So for instance, the sunglasses are rectangular is probably describing a situation where the sunglasses are not technically in the mathematical sense rectangular, but it's just an approximation. Yeah? And so there's a light adjustment of the adjective, of the property that we need to make to really arrive at the real meaning of this utterance. And then on the other side of this spectrum is something like he had a ton of work, where obviously he doesn't have a ton of work, but he had a lot of work. So here we have a hyperbole that is a severe adjustment of some kind of property, some kind of description we're using. So these are just some examples where I want to illustrate that in daily life, in normal conversation, we use a lot of expressions, utterances that require some kind of adjustment, that require some kind of extra work that is not there in the, let's say, in the literal representation of these words, and we do it rather effortlessly. Yeah? We sometimes need contextual support. We sometimes draw on conceptual information. We sometimes have to do inferences, but ultimately we always try to figure out what the speaker is trying to tell us. So it hardly ever happens that we go like, what is she trying to tell me? But we really do a lot of work to make sense of what somebody tells us and adjust these lexical information that we use. So in my talk today, I want to focus on metonymy. So an example like the cappuccino asks for the menu, where the cappuccino refers to the person drinking the cappuccino or ordering the beverage. So in this case, we use an expression to refer to something that isn't explicitly included in the conventional denotation of the expression. I wouldn't want to assume that we have a lexical representation for cappuccino, where cappuccino can refer to a drink and cappuccino can refer to a person. I mean, that would inflate our lexical representation, so we have to have some other means to arrive at the intended meaning. So the speaker here employs a very creative way of referring, at the expense that the hearer, the addressee, needs to draw certain inferences. So they need to determine that it's not the cappuccino, the beverage, but it's actually a person associated with this beverage that the person is referring to. So here we have a trade-off between the pragmatic principle of brevity and clarity. The speaker chooses a short description, a referential shorthand. I mean, they could have said, the woman who's sitting at the table in front of the window who ordered a cappuccino asked for the menu. But probably in the context of a restaurant, there's time pressure and you want to have some kind of brief description of that person. He probably also didn't know her name, otherwise he could have said Mary wants to have the menu. Yeah. So he's figuring out how he can communicate that the person needs the menu in the most effective and briefest way. So he opts for the cappuccino. And the hearer then has to draw certain inferences to arrive at the intended meaning. So there's a creative way of referring on the side of the speaker that requires the hearer to draw some inferences and typically engage in some additional work. Yeah? Oops, sorry, wrong way. So there's also additional inferences about the speaker's attitude that could be evoked by using a metonymy. Yeah? So sometimes we use metonymies, these type of shorthands, in a derogatory way, or here's an example from The Great Gatsby. East Egg, a place, East Egg condescending to West Egg and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. So here we have a place for person metonymy that alludes to the differences in one social status. So people born of wealthy families live in East Egg and newly rich people in West Egg. And it also alludes to differences in attitude. So there's the snobby, corrupt East Egg people versus the more modest West Egg people. Yeah? So we can have these additional inferences associated with the use of these shorthands or ways to identify a referent, but these come on top of more general mechanisms. So now the cappuccino example might be an extreme case, but I find it interesting because it shows us what kind of mechanisms we have to activate to arrive at the intended meaning, but the language system makes available numerous other instances of metonymy. So we have the property for person, the cappuccino, we have the place for person, East Egg and West Egg, but we also have something like the student read Dickens, where we use the author's name to refer to his work. Yeah, so a producer for product metonymy. We often use something like my neighbors met during Woodstock, where we have a place for event extension. 5, Henriette took a picture of the stone lion. So this lion is not an animate entity, but all we need to understand what a stone lion is the shape, the form of the lion. So we're extracting some piece of information of the lion to construct this idea of a statue. So we have an animal to statue extension here. Arthur drank the goblet, not just for Merlin, so obviously he didn't drink the goblet, but whatever was in the goblet. So we have a container for content metonymy. And we also have cases where we have some kind of predicate transfer, where the meaning adjustment is made explicit by the copula, as in 7, I am the black bean veggie burger. Yeah? So there's all kinds of meaning extensions and meaning adjustments that we find in everyday language. And there are nuanced differences between them. So you might have flinched when you heard the cappuccino once the menu, but when I say the student read Dickens, you probably didn't even realize that there was some kind of transfer from a person to their work. Yeah? And in the following, I want to argue that there are principled reasons to distinguish different types of metonymy, and there are good explanations for why Dickens seems to be easier, more conventionalized than the cappuccino case. So what I want to do this morning is to demonstrate that metonymy is not a uniform phenomenon, that these meaning extensions don't rely on a single kind of mechanism, but that there are differences that are reflected in the representation and the inferential demands, and that this is mirrored in the underlying processes that we can observe. And I want to propose that these differences might emerge because of meaning evolution, because of language evolution, and actually reflect different stages of semantic change. Yeah? There's a diachronic component to it, but I want to show that we can also tap into real-time language change. Yeah? And in the last part of my talk, I will look at a further factor of variation that is different cognitive, or rather neural profiles of individuals who are processing these metonymies. So let's start with the representation and processing of metonymy. So in the literature, you find a lot of different frameworks for how the representations might look at, or what triggers a meaning extension. Here, I want to focus on the claim that there are different types of metonymy that rely on different representation and mechanisms, and ultimately I think it's a continuum that we can describe with different stages of the meaning evolution. Yeah. So when we look at the cappuccino example, this is a case that clearly relies on situation-specific parameters. It works very well when you hear it in a cafe or in a restaurant context, and in these cases you construct the intended meaning in an ad hoc way. So I want to refer to these types of metonymies as ad hoc uses. On the other hand, the student read Dickens is a case that relies more immediately on semantic and conceptual associations. And so I want to look at these examples as more conventionalized uses. So for the ad hoc metonymies, we need a situation-specific support. We need contextual support to construct the intended meaning, and we need a referential shift here from the salient property, the substance, to the individual. So we are transferring the meaning, the referent, from the substance to the person. And in the literature, we find a number of prerequisites for these type of ad hoc metonymies. So for example, Nunberg argues that the property has to be salient or noteworthy. So if you're at a restaurant, it doesn't really make sense to say the drink, ask for the menu, assuming that everyone had a drink. If everyone had a cappuccino, it's also not meaningful to say the cappuccino, ask for the menu. So we have to pick a salient property to really identify the referent we're talking about. Second, there has to be a functional correspondence between the property and the referent. So the drinker, the orderer of a beverage, the wearer of a particular piece of clothes. Yeah, so if there's one person with a green shirt, then we can identify them by saying the green shirt wants to have the menu. You can be an expert on a particular topic and so on. Yeah? So a salient property and then a functional correspondence between this property and the referent, and what I already said, it has to be contextually supported. Yeah? So imagine that I have office hours and a number of students are coming up to talk about their term papers. So in this context, I might refer to them as the metonymy or the relative clause attachment, because that is their topic and that is salient for me and that is contextually valid. Yeah? So anyway, it has been observed that for these type of ad hoc metonymies, the reference shift results in the fact that the original meaning is no longer accessible. And this can be tested by co-predication, coordination, or co-reference tests. So one is odd. The cappuccino asked for the menu and had a nutty flavor with a base of bitterness, because the nutty flavor with a base of bitterness refers to the substance. But in the first clause, the cappuccino asked for the menu, I transferred the meaning to the person contextually associated with the cappuccino, and so the substance is no longer accessible. On the other hand, the cappuccino asked for the menu and later ordered an appetizer is fine. So if I combine two utterances, both referring to the person, I can do that, but I can't mix or go back to the original meaning. Maybe with some extra cost and another meaning shift, but that usually doesn't work. And similar, we observe that for pronominal co-reference, we need to refer to the person within an animate personal pronoun and not to the substance with an inanimate personal pronoun. So the cappuccino asked for the menu. She was in the mood for a delicious appetizer is fine, but the cappuccino asked for the menu. It was in the mood for a delicious appetizer is out. Yeah? So this has been taken as evidence that the original meaning is no longer accessible in the mental representation. In contrast to this, for conventionalized metonymies, such as the Dickens example, we rely on semantic and conceptual information. So Dickens is an author, and his purpose or his goals are to produce literature, stories, and so on. And so in this case, if we have some kind of semantic relation, conceptual relation between the possible meanings, then we can select or derive the intended meaning on the basis of the semantic and conceptual information. And so there's different approaches out there. So there's the idea of rich lexical representations that help us to identify one or the other sense. So for instance, in Pustejovsky's generative lexicon, we have rich representation of the makeup of a concept, its constituents, its purpose, its origin, and so on. So in this representation, Dickens also bears some information about his work that we can then access. Or there's the idea of underspecified representations, that we have a lexical representation for Dickens that is underspecified in the sense that it can fit the author and his work reading. And for the diagnostics, we observe that in contrast to these ad hoc metonymies, the two senses can be accessed in co-predication or co-reference. So it's okay to say the student read and met Dickens in 1845. So we can, pick up the work in the reading case and the author in the meeting case and combine that. So both senses are equally available. And we can also have something like the student read Dickens, the work, the author, fascinated her. So when we process Dickens, both of the senses are equally accessible. Okay. So this seems to suggest that we have, two types or two extremes of metonymy representation. On the one hand, we have these conventionalized uses that make available the senses in the lexical representation. And on the other hand, we have these ad hoc uses where we require a referential shift and the updating of the discourse representation, for instance, from the substance to the person, and then ultimately only the intended referent is accessible in the discourse representation. And this dissociation between the Dickens and the Cappuccino cases finds repercussions in processing. So a number of research groups have looked at the processing of metonymy using reaction time measures, eye tracking measures, event-related brain potentials. So the generalization is that for these conventionalized metonymies, processing the student read Dickens is as straightforward as processing the student met Dickens. Yeah? And so we don't find any differences in reading times, in eye tracking measures, or in event-related brain potential. So here you see an event-related brain potential at one electrode for processing Dickens in these two types of contexts, and there's no difference between them. And this is the case as long as the different senses are known or are established. So there's a very nice study by Frison and Pickering where they look at these author or product for producer, producer for product metonymies. And so when you replace Dickens with Needham, and you say the student read Needham, but you've never heard of an author whose name is Needham, then you actually don't have access to this representation and processing cost emerges. But when I have a context sentence and say, my grandmother has a huge library and her favorite author is Needham, she read Needham on her way to the beach, then we have established this entity as an author and we have access to this author for work extension. Yeah? So the conventionalized metonymies seem to be processed relatively effortlessly. In contrast, these metonymies, ad hoc metonymies that require a referential shift, show evidence that processing the metonymy, the cappuccino asked for the menu, is more costly than processing a control condition where cappuccino is used in the substance sense. And in ERP studies, we find a late positivity for the extended meaning compared to the control condition. And I'll give you some more background on ERPs later on because that's going to be important for the second part of my talk. Yeah? But so in general, what we observe that on the one hand, we have these cases of conventionalized senses, conventionalized extensions, where no processing cost is observable. And this has been shown for a number of different types of metonymic patterns, so for producer for product relations, for place for event, the Vietnam case, for place for institution, so the university called or something like that, and content for container. I put the beer on the table. I didn't put the beer on the table, but the bottle or the glass of beer. Yeah. And in all of these cases, using different measures, no difference has been observed between the extension, between the sense selection and the original denotation. On the other hand, ad hoc metonymies require a referential shift and evoke some kind of processing cost in eye tracking, in reaction times, in event-related brain potentials. And again, there have been a number of cases that have been investigated. So the property for person, the animal for statue, so the stone lion or the wooden turtle, count to mass alternations, imported pear versus a green pear, container for content, I drank the bottle, and so on. So while it looks like there's two types of metonymy, I think that ultimately what we're tapping in is a continuum of processing effort, a continuum of conventionalization in the end, where we can observe different stages of the evolution of a particular extended meaning. Yeah? And we'll come back to that in a second. But before we get to language evolution and language adaptation, I wanted to give you a little background on ERPs in case there's some people who are not that familiar with it. Because in the following studies I want to present, we're going to look at electrophysiological data. So event-related brain potentials is a measure that provides a high temporal resolution of the underlying processes. So we are measuring the human electrical or the electrical activity of the human brain by putting electrodes on the skull of people. And the electrical activity that we can observe on top of the head is associated with specific cognitive events, motor events, or sensory events. And so whenever we observe some kind of process that requires extra cost, we can observe this in the electrophysiological profile. Importantly, the neural responses that we're recording can be time-locked to a stimulus. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to time lock the signal, the neural signal, to the onset of the referential expression, so say the cappuccino. Yeah? And that allows us to really chart the time course of the underlying processes and observe what happens within, say, 1,000 milliseconds after hearing the cappuccino. And the beautiful aspect of event-related brain potentials is that these signatures we observe can be functionally interpreted. And so there's two candidate ERP signatures that I would expect for the processing of metonymy and for referential processing in more general, and actually also for other types of processes, but let's stick to reference for now. So the first one is the N400, a negativity peaking around 400 milliseconds after the onset of the critical referential expression. And this has been associated with prediction error. So we constantly build an internal model of the world, an internal model of the conversation. Yeah? And based on this internal model and the context information we have, our brain generates predictions about the next entity that's coming up, about its semantics, about its morphosyntax, and so on. Yeah? And when this prediction is met, everything is fine. Yeah? The entity is integrated. When the prediction is not met, then we observe a prediction error that is reflected in a more pronounced negativity compared to a minimally differing control condition. So we always compare two conditions, and that's why you always see a metonymy or meaning extension condition compared to a control condition that doesn't require extra work. So that's the N400 for predictive processing. What we've actually found in our work on metonymy is that if I say Mary talked to the cappuccino compared to Mary drank the cappuccino, we observe an N400 because the context is too sparse to actually generate predictions that cappuccino could come up. Yeah? But if I change this and minimally add some kind of contextual support, and I say the waiter talked to the cappuccino versus the waiter had a cappuccino, then the N400 diminishes. So this semantic network of waiter and restaurant suffices to lower this prediction error in this minimal context. And that's why for some of the examples, you might not see an N400. But so that's just for the background, that this is a very sensitive signal that uses contextual information. What I find more interesting for the question of semantic and pragmatic processing and referential processing is the late positive potential. It's a positive going ERP signature with a somewhat later onset, around 700 milliseconds, say. This can be associated with the updating of the mental representation, the updating of the discourse structure, and it reflects the inferential demands and the inferential effort that we're putting in arriving at the intended meaning. So the referential shift from the substance to the person requires some kind of updating of my mental representation to establish the referent as a person. And this type of effort, this type of process results in processing costs reflected in a late positivity. And maybe one last hint how to read these figures, because I didn't label the axis. So on the horizontal axis, you have the time course in milliseconds. So here you see 0, the onset at the vertical crossing, and then you see about 1,000 milliseconds, after hearing or reading the critical word. And on the vertical axis, we have the mean amplitude difference in microvolt, where negativity is plotted up. So that's why the N4, the blue line, is more negative than the red line, and the positivity goes down. Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to more interesting things. This is very technical. So what's the difference between the Dickens case and the cappuccino case? So I kind of already, build it into the labels I gave them. So I want to argue that the Dickens cases represent conventionalized meanings, conventionalized senses, and that's what makes it easy to access the product or the producer reading, while the cappuccino cases, are ad hoc. They need some kind of contextual, situational support. Language evolution, meaning evolution seems to be at work. Yeah, that something is used in a particular situation and then might be dispersed to the whole language community. So I would like to propose that the two types of metonymy, or the two extremes of metonymic patterns, are tied to the communicative need. Yeah, so I want to express something, and the use of a particular expression as a function of time. That is, there is a communicative need that results in a selection of a particular referential form, linguistic form, and this language use may be repeated across time and across speakers over and over again. And so if we add the dimension of time or dispersion, that would allow us to describe discrete stages of the evolution of a particular meaning. And colleagues who, have worked on historical linguistics have nice models and nice explanations of this, in that there are different stages of meaning evolution, where we first might encounter an individual act of innovation, an ad hoc use. Yeah, we also find this quite a bit with children, who don't know yet how to refer to things, and they just invent something, and we are able to understand them. This individual act of innovation might start to be used in a particular discourse context among friends, in a restaurant, in a hospital, and so on. And ultimately, it could be used by the entire speech community, and at that stage, it's conventionalized. Yeah? It enters our lexical representation. Yeah? So there's a collective process, or there could be a collective process of adoption and diffusion, starting with very singular events of some kind of meaning extension, going all the way to the use of an entire speech community. So now, since I'm so the cappuccino cases are then examples for the ad hoc use, or possibly the use in a particular context, with some processing cost associated with it, and the large-scale dispersion would then lead to conventionalization and the application of cognitive routines, and hence no costs. So the question then is, can stages of use account for different processing patterns? So now, if you've thought about language change, the development of something to become conventionalized, can take decades and centuries and quite a long time. So if I want to test this using event-related brain potentials, that's a bit complicated, because I can't go back in time and put EEG caps on people's heads. But we thought, wait a moment. A promising testing ground to look at language change kind of now is to look at the evolution of new meanings that we often find with place for event metonymies. You know, if an event happens in the world, we quite often use a shortcut to refer to the event by referring to the place, by using the place name where it happened. Yeah. So Woodstock. Yeah, when you think of Woodstock, you probably think of the cultural event and not so much of the city. Yeah. 5 years ago, everyone was talking about Ischgl, at least in Germany. I don't know if you've heard about this, but Ischgl was a hotspot of COVID-19. So at that time, it was very easy to talk about, since Ischgl, I don't like to go to bars anymore, or something like that. But nowadays, if I utter this, you're probably like, what is since Ischgl? Yeah? So the interesting thing about these place for event metonymies is that something like Woodstock, the event reading stays on. It might even take over. Something like Ischgl, hopefully it decays and we don't talk about this so much anymore. And in other cases, we might face a situation where both the place and the event reading are equally accessible. Yeah. So Woodstock, I would say, is a case where, the event reading has taken over the place reading, at least in terms of associative strengths. Bayreuth is a place in Germany that has a classic music festival. It's very famous. But if I ask my 20-year-old students, what do you associate Bayreuth with? It's not classical music and an event, but it's a city in Bavaria. Yeah. So we have two cultural events, but one where the event reading is very prominent, very salient, and one where the event reading, at least for a certain generation or people with a certain cultural background, is not that hot and not that prominent. So what we did is we looked at place for event metonymies and expected that some would have a dominant place reading and some would have a dominant event reading. We recorded extension cases, metonymic extensions and their controls. So we had a sentence with a place and a sentence with an event reading. And in addition to that, we carried out a rating task where we asked participants to indicate whether they associated the expression with a place or with an event. And then we used these ratings as a continuous measure in the analysis of our ERP profiles. Yeah. So we asked 65 participants to indicate using a slider that went from 0 to 100, whether they associated the expression with a place or an event. And in fact, we got quite a nice mix of expressions. So on top, we have cases where the association with the event was close to 80% in this case. So there we had Chernobyl, Pearl Harbor, Woodstock. So these are cases where the event reading is more salient than the place reading. And at the bottom of the figure, we have cases like Bayreuth, Korea, referring to the Korean War, or Egypt, that was used as a metonymy during the Green Revolution. Talking too much about evolution. So this is a case where the place reading is very prominent. Yeah, and so we then thought, okay, so these Woodstock cases that have a prominent event reading should show some kind of effect of conventionalization of the event reading, while the Bayreuth cases should show processing effort when we use these entities as these expressions as events. Yeah? And for the course analysis of the ERP data, the idea would be that an example such as Woodstock that has mostly event associations, we shouldn't find, and we didn't find a difference between something like the promoter organized Woodstock versus Bob Dylan lived in Woodstock. Yeah, so no difference between referring to the place or the event. In contrast to this, for the Bayreuth case, where we have mostly place associations, so Barbara attended the university in Bayreuth, is the expected use of this place name versus the Wagner family organized Bayreuth. We find that the event reading in blue shows a more pronounced late positivity compared to the place reading. And actually, so this is just for the course analysis, if we look at, so here we now look at the fitted amplitude value of the late positivity over left midline and right posterior electrode sides, and for the rating task. So 0 is a preference for the place, and 1 is a preference for the event. And so what we observe here is that the amplitude of the late positivity depends on the rating. So you can already see that it's not a flat horizontal line, but there's some effect of the rating. And it turns out that the less conventionalized a particular use is, the more pronounced is the late positivity. And we find this both for the event readings and the place readings. So for the place for event metonymy in blue, turquoise, let's say blue, in blue, we observe that when the event reading is more conventionalized, so going towards 1 on the horizontal axis, a higher rating, then the late positivity decreases. Yeah? So there's less effort in arriving at the event reading. And for the place reading in red, we see that the late positivity increases with higher ratings for the event denotation. And that means that in these cases, if the event reading is prominent, such as the Woodstock case, then it's actually somewhat costly to process something like Bob Dylan lived in Woodstock, because the event reading is more dominant in the mental representation than the place reading. Yeah? So this is an interesting effect and a view on language change using place for event metonymies. Yeah? So the meaning extension's potential for conventionalization and for, becoming part of the larger language community has consequences for language processing. The meaning shift, the updating that is observable in the late positivity, is modulated by the degree of conventionalization. And so here we have shown that historical factors, socio-cultural factors, impact the evolution of lexical representations for place for event alternations, and we can measure this in real time. So now, moving on from this, the next question would be, well, how quickly can meaning change be instantiated? Yeah? Can we observe some kind of adaptation to a particular use of a speaker immediately, or does it take a while to arrive at this? And so this is some work that Gwendalina Royle has conducted in her dissertation that she submitted a couple weeks ago. And so she wanted to find out how the repeated use of extended metonymic expressions is processed in real time, and whether conventionalization, or in this case it's probably more appropriate to talk about adaptation, can be observed in real time. And so she came up with this idea to look at reports, 5 to 7 minute long reports on experience with dating apps or friendship apps. Yeah? Because she thought, well, these apps are characterized by their fast pace, where people frequently meet a lot of different people, and so it's kind of a suitable context for metonymic use when you tell somebody about your experience with this app and your experience of, meeting multiple people. And you can actually, it's not only used for dating, it's also used for business contacts and really for, friends who want to go running with you or something like that. So she constructed different scenarios. In each of these reports, there were metonymic references like the mustache, referring to a person who has a noteworthy mustache, and some controls like the pharmacist. And these referential expressions were mentioned 5 times over the course of the report. And then she she compared the ERP signatures to the metonymic reference and to the control. And what we found, first of all, for the ERP effect for all mentions across the whole report is for the metonymy in orange, a more pronounced N400 followed by a late positivity. So there's some kind of prediction error whenever I talk about the mustache as a person, followed by a late positivity being indicative of a referential shift. Yeah. But what is more important is to look at what happens with each mention across the report. And here we have mention 1, which is when the metonymic use is first introduced, mention 2, 3, and 4, for the left posterior and the right posterior electrode sites. And what you can see if you compare the different mentions is that both the N400 and the late positivity change across time. Let's look at this in a bit more detail by looking at the fitted mean amplitude. So let's first look at the N400 time window. And what you see here is the fitted mean amplitude on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis you find the mention which is Z-transformed, because across the stories it occurs with different distances, so we transformed these and didn't work with mention 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you see the metonymic condition in orange showing a decrease of the N400 with increasing mention, and a somewhat similar pattern for the control, but it's really pronounced for the metonymy. So this suggests that the metonymic use becomes less unexpected, becomes more predictable as the reports unfold. So this makes sense. You kind of get tuned into the fact that people use such metonymic expressions. In addition, over frontal electrode sites, we see a somewhat reverse pattern with a gradient increase of the N400 with increasing mention. And so what this seems to suggest is that the increasing ambiguity between the original meaning of mustache as some kind of a facial hairdo and the intended meaning, mustache referring to a person, start to compete with each other. So it's not the case that we only use the intended meaning, but we get some kind of interference from the original meaning. And this is what Robin Carsten, for instance, has discussed in the context of lingering literal meaning. So even in the context, I want to refer to the person, I still get some interference with the original meaning, and this seems to be reflected in this frontal negativity effect, which by McGregor has also been shown for subordinate meanings of homonyms. So this fits quite nicely. So for the late positivity, we observe a gradient decrease of the late positivity for the metonymy in orange, with increasing mention. So the more often I use a metonymic expression in these reports, the less costly it becomes, the less effort I need to invest in updating. So, the interesting thing for me, I think, is that it's not the case that, at the first mention, I'm getting rid of the original denotation, something these diagnostics showed. But it's really the case when I get the mustache again, I have to do some kind of inference again to arrive at the fact that, this refers to a person and not the property. But the effort I have to put in decreases as with increasing use of these entities. Yeah? Okay, so repeated metonymic use eases language comprehension. Yeah? And we have seen this by the decreasing late positivity that reflects the adaptation to the particular use conditions of the person who reports on their experience. So the inferential work is reduced as story unfolds. The idea of meaning adaptation is supported by the decreasing N400 over posterior side that reflects a lowering of the prediction error. And it's also supported by the increasing N400 over frontal electrode sides, showing that the competition between the original and the extended meaning is enhanced as we become more used to this type of metonymic use. Yeah. Okay, last part. So variation seems to be due to the historical, the socio-cultural context. It can be established within a particular communicative situation. What about individual traits as a further sort of variation? So an emerging topic with respect to language processing in the past years has been the impact of individual differences on language processing. So in general, we have observed that working memory capacity, executive function, that is inhibition, updating, or shifting of information, have revealed differences in the underlying processes. In pragmatic, social cognition plays an important role. So we look at a theory of mind capacity, at communicative skills, but also exposure to literature, for example, as a source of variation. And you will hear more about this in the plenary symposium talks following the coffee break. So here I want to adopt a different approach to individual differences, and that is a neuroscientific approach. Yeah? So I want to show that the way people process information and the neural noise, or how they deal with neural noise, actually has an impact on their underlying processes. And it has been shown that individual variation is reflected in something called individual alpha frequency, and I'll give you some background on this in a second, as well as the 1/f slope. And importantly, individuals exhibit variation with respect to the speed of their oscillatory activity, or the oscillatory activity of their neural system. And this is reflected in the peak frequency of the dominant alpha rhythm. And so we have different frequency band that our brain oscillates in. The alpha band ranges somewhere between 8 and 13 hertz, and it's typically observed in a resting state. Yeah? And now what we do is, before we start recording data for an experiment, we ask participants to sit quietly for 2 minutes with their eyes open and 2 minutes with their eyes closed. And we do the same at the end of the experiment. And this gives us an idea of their alpha rhythm in a resting state. And then based on these resting states, we can analyze their individual alpha peak, which varies somewhere between 9 and 12 or 9 and 11.5 hertz. And we can also measure the 1/f slope for this resting state. Okay, let's give you some more background, because this might be new to most of you. It's been new to me a couple months, years ago as well. So the individual alpha frequency, is something that's based on the alpha cycle, that serves as a temporal window for communication between the neuronal groups. That is, we have a time window of sampling, or a time window for processing incoming information. And that window can be smaller or larger. So a high alpha frequency means that I have more neural cycles per millisecond, and a low alpha frequency means that I have fewer neural cycles per millisecond. And what that means is that depending on my individual alpha frequency, information processing might be quicker or slower in general, because I'm sampling at different rates. Okay. And there have been some nice behavioral tasks. So we see that high alpha frequency correlates with quicker processing, for instance, in a signal detection task or in a task where participants' ability was tested to distinguish two separate flashing lights. And if the flashing is within 500 milliseconds, some people detect it as one flashing and others detect it as two flashing. And that ability correlates with the alpha rhythm and the alpha cycle. So that has to do with how fast you process information and go through this cycle. For language processing, there have also been some studies that have looked at initial alpha frequency and language processing. And the take-home message is that higher initial alpha frequency, makes it possible to have a higher likelihood of carrying out reanalysis or a higher reliance on prediction, because I'm just overall faster in processing. So we find an effect of this with different contexts and with different ERP signatures, but the importance is that there's a higher or more effective process of updating reanalysis or prediction that correlates with the individual alpha frequency. Okay. For the aperiodic 1/f slope, we are looking at part of the power spectrum of the brain. And so this is the background noise or background activity that is not tied to specific frequencies. And it decreases exponentially with increasing frequency. So what you see on the figure is on the vertical axis, the log transform power, the strength of the neural activity, where higher values indicate greater activity. And then on the horizontal axis, you see the frequency characteristics. And what we observe here is that for more power, when power is high, frequency is low. And so here we see that the slope exponentially decreases with increasing frequencies. So what it represents is a balance between neural excitation and inhibition. That is a steep slope, indicate that there's greater inhibition of neural activity, and a flat slope indicates that there's greater excitation. And so this is an indicator for the extent of synchrony during neural firing. And in a nutshell, what's important for us is that high neural noise levels may impair information processing. So people with a steeper slope are better processors than people with a flat slope. And for language processing, again, this has been investigated in various contexts, but in a nutshell, higher synchrony facilitates predictive coding. Higher synchrony results in better model adaptation. So again, we should find some kind of correlation of this efficient use of signal, of the use of signal-to-noise ratio, the degree of the use of signal-to-noise ratio on the underlying processing mechanisms. So do these neuropsychological individual difference modulate the processing of the underlying metonymic use? And how do they affect referential shift and conventionalization? So here we use the data from Gwendalina Royal with these dating app reports, and we calculated the initial alpha frequency and the 1/f slope for the participants. and then use this as a factor in the analysis. So for the initial alpha frequency, we first predicted for the N400 that participants with a higher initial alpha frequency should show a more pronounced N400 because they use their predictive machinery more efficiently. We didn't find that. For the late positivity, we first expected that people with higher initial alpha frequency should show a more pronounced late positivity because they have a higher likelihood of model updating, of reanalysis of this kind of shift. And this is what we found. So here you see there was an interaction that was significant in the right posterior ROI only. This is why I show you this ROI only. For the low, the medium, and the high initial alpha frequency group. So this is just plotted for visual purposes. In the analysis, it was a continuous factor. And again, you see the fitted mean amplitude on the vertical axis and the mention on the horizontal axis. And what we observe is that for the high initial alpha frequency group at the bottom, there was a more pronounced late positivity compared to the other two groups. And in addition, we expected a more steeply decreasing positivity across mention within the report for the higher initial alpha frequency group, and this was also supported, like you see in the bottom plot. For the 1/f slope, we predicted a steeper slope. People with steeper slope should show a larger N400, facilitating predictive coding. We didn't find that. We also expected for the late positivity, and let me show you this. People with a steeper slope, now at the top, should show a larger late positivity that is easier updating, easier reanalysis due to model adaptation. And this is what we observe nicely in ROI2. And in addition, a higher reduction of the late positivity amplitude over time. And this is also what we see at the top plot, that over time, people with a steep aperiodic 1/f slope show better model adaptation and less processing costs reflected in the late positivity. So to sum up, we see that high initial alpha frequency is beneficial and yields higher effort at reconceptualization, but it also means more effective reconceptualization. People have a higher sampling rate, process information quicker, and that is why they are more effective at updating and reconceptualization. Overall, they are also better, we are better at adapting to this metonymic use. The steeper slope yields a better filtering of relevant information, because there's less neural noise. And so these participants have a greater ability to focus on the relevant, the metonymic meaning, while inhibiting the irrelevant original denotation. And so there's a faster meaning adaptation process. So I think this is one of the benefits, kind of to bridge to the symposium, one of the benefits of looking at these neuroscientific measures of individual variation is that they are stable. If I measure working memory demands or executive function, they are not that stable. They depend on whether I have a good day or a bad day, whether it's morning or afternoon, whether I had a cup of coffee or not. And we'll probably talk about this a little bit later. So these are stable individual traits. And I find it interesting to see how they influence meaning extension, how they influence adaptation. So to wrap up with a boring conclusion, I have argued that we should distinguish between types of meaning extensions reflected in a continuum depending on the historical context or the particular situational use. This distinction is engendered in discrete processing profiles, which are modulated by individual variation reflected in the neural activity. And the distinction is also grounded in stages of meaning evolution, with, on the one hand, these conventionalized uses, and on the other hand, these ad hoc uses. So this was all I wanted to tell you today about metonymy and metonymy processing. Thank you very much. And I guess before we have some cappuccino or some coffee, I'll be happy to hear your questions.